In vainglory they arose, shouting challenges at the gods, but prevail they did not. Their doom it was to walk the mist until time's end.
Golden ages cannot last forever, no matter how mighty the empire behind them may be. Decline comes for all. It is inevitable. The Final Fantasy franchise had one of the most remarkable runs of form the video game industry has ever seen during its golden age. In the span of 7 years, 1994 to 2001, we saw the release of Final Fantasy VI through X, and each one of them became an instant classic. Chances are, if you ask a fan of the franchise what they think of when they think of Final Fantasy, their answer will come from one of these 5 games. An entire generation grew up to these titles, and it's no wonder that these 5 games consistently rank at the top as fan favorites. But golden ages cannot last forever. And that's where our story begins for Final Fantasy XII. The pressures to succeed, the weight of expectations from the fans, and ultimately the inability to deliver on those lofty goals. Upon its release, Final Fantasy XII held the Guinness World Record for longest video game development time, having started development in December of 2000 and releasing in March of 2006. While this might not feel significant now, as the average development cycle for games is 3 to 5 years, the Final Fantasy franchise up until that point had released a mainline title every 1 to 2.5 years. The gap between Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII was the longest in franchise history. Now I hear you asking, what about Final Fantasy XI? And that is an excellent question. You see, Final Fantasy XI was the first game to truly buck all tradition for the franchise, as it was the first mainline title to not be a single-player RPG. Instead, it was released as an MMORPG. So while yes, there was a game released between Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, for many fans of the franchise, it was inaccessible to them and might as well not have existed at all. Thus created the first burden that Final Fantasy XII would have to shoulder. For an entire section of fans, this would be the first touchpoint to the franchise in the longest span of time in franchise history. Not to mention the bad taste that the MMO decision would leave in people's mouths, making the critical eye cast upon 12 even greater than it would have been originally. Final Fantasy XI would not be the only game that would break fan expectations during the development cycle of Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy X-2 released in 2003 as a huge departure from its predecessor, and it quickly became one of the most polarizing titles in franchise history. Final Fantasy VII received a third-person shooter sequel focusing on Vincent, releasing only a couple months ahead of Final Fantasy XII, again breaking away from fan expectations and desires from the company. In addition to this, we saw the release of Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, games that, while hugely popular, did have a certain stigma around the use of Final Fantasy characters. All this to say, the 5-year gap between Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII created a huge burden of expectation from the fans. But the fans weren't the only ones with growing expectations of Final Fantasy. Going back to Final Fantasy X, its development ran into struggles that forced it to miss its original ship date. This delay would create a near $20 million loss for the fiscal year. The following year, the flop of Final Fantasy's first feature-length movie, Spirits Within, amounted to an almost $100 million loss. These massive critical failures created massive upheaval within the company and forced Square to restructure their operations. They need to expand, innovate, and grow to new heights, ended up sending the franchise spiraling from the top of the industry mountain. And yet another burden was placed upon the shoulders of Final Fantasy XII. It needed to be a commercial success. With all of these factors in play, it's understandable that development of Final Fantasy XII was wrought with struggles from beginning to end. With all hands on deck developing Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XI, the reins for Final Fantasy XII were handed to Yasumi Matsuno, who had previously handled Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre, and Vagrant Story. The hallmark of these titles was a darker and more political tone than the Final Fantasy series was traditionally known for, and it's that change of pace that led Matsuno to be tasked with Final Fantasy XII. From the onset, 12 was meant to be different from everything that preceded it. Matsuno's Vagrant Story team followed him into 12's development, and then the team was further supplemented with those who had worked on 11. This mashup of teams would not go smoothly, and the different ideologies of the two teams would create conflict on how each side thought the game should be designed. And that wasn't the only conflict plaguing the team. After having restructured due to massive failures, the new corporate leadership took a much more involved role in development to try and ensure that design decisions were made to most optimally set the title up for global commercial success. These meddlings were diametrically opposed to the initial vision of the game and forced vast reworks of the game and story to accommodate them. Ultimately, these internal conflicts caused such a rift that Matsuno ended up leaving the project the year prior to release, citing health reasons. You'd think that release would be the end of woes for Final Fantasy XII, but there was one last blow for the game. Final Fantasy XII released on March of 2006 for the PlayStation 2. In November of that same year, the PlayStation 3 released. The only saving grace here was the negativity surrounding Sony's decision to not include backwards compatibility with every model. Everything surrounding the conception and release of Final Fantasy XII was a mess. So many were the burdens that plagued it that it's a miracle it saw release at all. And that's why it's so important to talk about the context of 12's development and its release. Focusing solely on the game's story and gameplay doesn't do the title justice. It removes the heart and soul and history that make it such a pivotal moment in franchise history. I was 14 when 12 released, and my exposure to video games at large back then was pretty limited. The only Final Fantasy title I owned was 10. As hard as I searched for other titles, I couldn't find them, and even if I did, I wouldn't have been able to afford them. So when 11 came out and was completely inaccessible to me, I was devastated, because that meant so much longer for me to wait to play another Final Fantasy. Then, when it finally released, it was so different from anything else I'd experienced and nowhere near what I had expected that it left me disappointed. And for the longest time, I held Final Fantasy XII in such low esteem. To me, the only redeeming quality was an interesting soundtrack. I don't particularly like my teenage self upon critical inspection as an adult. I didn't play Kingdom Hearts for years because I refused to play a Disney abomination of Final Fantasy. I never finished 12 for the PS2, and it wasn't until the Zodiac Age remaster came around that I ended up giving 12 a second shot. From that experience, I learned that teenage me's opinion is not to be trusted. Having said all of this, having laid out all of the hurdles and burdens Final Fantasy XII faced, I can honestly say that it is one of my favorite games in the entire series, and that in and of itself is such a miraculous accomplishment that it makes me love the game even more. Final Fantasy XII is far from perfect. The numerous design changes during development are definitely seen and felt in its initial release, but a lot of those problems are addressed, if not outright fixed, in the Zodiac Age remaster. Without a doubt, the biggest and most impressive part of the game is the vibe that it manages to create within its world. No other Final Fantasy, apart from 10, has been able to grab hold of me with its setting as much as 12 does. Ivalice is such a wonderful place to experience thanks to the immaculate graphic design of its locales and the astounding and accompanying soundtrack. At every step of the journey, I felt compelled to explore every inch of the environment presented to me. Every location feels lived in and has a story to tell if you want to seek it out. You can easily see the influence that Final Fantasy XI had on the team because 12 truly feels as if you're playing a single-player MMO at times. The scope and options available to you are immense. This is easily the longest single-player game in the entire franchise. Looking at how long to beat, the average completionist run is 170 hours. Final Fantasy X is listed at 155 by comparison. This is a massive game, and it isn't even fully completed Vision. This behemoth had content cut. I can only dream of the full, uncompromised vision of Final Fantasy XII. However, this is also its detriment at times, as a significant portion of your time is spent traversing expansive open areas and sprawling dungeons. If you're aiming to explore Ivalice in its entirety, it's going to take you some serious hours. On top of this, many zones have more than one form that you'll need to navigate in order to trigger certain game elements. For example, the Giza Plains has a weather cycle based on the endgame clock. 1 hour of rain followed by 2 hours of dry. This cycle is based on the hours played timer, and thus you have to wait in real time for the cycle to change. So if you have a quest that requires the plains to be raining, you either have to find other things to do in game, or you simply leave the game running and go do something else in real life. This isn't the end of frustrating mechanics. There are many different side quests throughout Ivalice that you can experience. However, there's no quest log for these, and it's entirely possible to lose the thread completely. While for the most part, you're not going to get any rewards that are necessary to complete the game, there are significant story beats that can be missed. And in some cases, those side quests do give you an item that is necessary to fully complete the game. Looking at you, Earth Tyrant. But this is what makes 12 amazing. And while incredibly frustrating, it gave me purpose to talk to NPCs and explore the world to try to uncover its secrets. Final Fantasy XII made me want to explore everything it had to offer so that I could learn everything I could about Ivalice. I didn't want the experience to end, and thankfully the game gave me a very large amount of content to chew through so I could spend as much time as possible within its world. From hunting down the biggest and baddest marks Clan Centurio had to offer, to diving the depths of the world in order to uncover all the espers and learn their stories. At every turn there was something for me to pursue. I will admit that I am a traditionalist when it comes to my JRPGs. I love a good turn-based combat system. Final Fantasy X is probably my favorite combat system of all time, and Persona 5 proved that turn-based combat had a place in modern games. Final Fantasy XII is decidedly not a turn-based game. The gambit system utilized a sort of programming logic-based approach to set up your party for combat. For example, you would set up your healer with a gambit that stated if ally less than 50% health, cast cure, and every time a party member dropped under 50% health, the mage would automatically heal them as long as they had mana. As a kid, I hated Final Fantasy XII's combat. I was, however, a very dumb kid.
Boo! You stink!
Playing through it now, I really enjoy the complexity provided by the gambit system. While you can definitely do the bare minimum with gambits to face tank the entire game, it was definitely rewarding to set up different gambit styles based on my needs. Pre-gaming big dungeons or boss fights by tweaking my gambits and who my party was comprised of added a layer of strategy to the game that I don't usually experience in JRPGs. And because of it, I used a lot more of my party members throughout my campaign. Which leads to the next mechanic relating to your party, the job system. I am a huge fan of the Final Fantasy job system. Being able to fully customize your party and each member's role, regardless of how they're portrayed within the narrative, is an absolute joy. While the initial release had its issues with the job system, the Zodiac Age completely nails it and honestly rivals the Sphere Grid system in my opinion. While you can build your party however you like, duplicating roles and jobs across different members, in my playthrough I decided that I wanted each member to be unique and to use every job across the party. I spent more time than I would ever like to admit setting up my jobs, but by the end of it I had a diverse set of characters who I could rotate in and out as I needed, and again it allowed me to utilize more parties throughout the game. And for the first time in any RPG I ever played, I got to the end of the game with my entire party being near the same level. This being said, the game doesn't really require this level of complexity, and that's kind of a shame. While running a party of all white mages could make things complicated, you could absolutely beat the entire game that way and it not be the most difficult thing in the world. That's not to say 12 is a cakewalk of a game. There are certainly large swaths of the game where you can turn on the 4X mode and just steamroll through everything, but there are plenty of areas and encounters that will absolutely destroy you if you don't take your time and actually plan things out. That only leaves one area left to talk about: the story and characters. This is one of the biggest sticking points for critics of the game, as out of all the changes that occurred within development, this is the easiest to spot. The decision to make Vaughn and Penelo stand-ins for the player and their late inclusion in the game means they don't really impact the story all that much. The game happens to them, and I can understand frustrations around that type of character, but I kinda liked it. Just as I was experiencing all of Ivalice for the first time, so too were Vaughn and Penelo. It's refreshing to see an RPG protagonist be along for the ride as they interacted with the cast around them and their bigger stories. It felt very grounded in that aspect and presented the story of this political drama in a way that was easy to digest. All of the other party members are more interesting than you, and it adds a layer to the story that largely doesn't exist in the franchise. It's like being able to watch a heist movie from the perspective of the newbie just joining the team and getting to be introduced to the established crew bit by bit, learning all of their backstories, the motivations and goals. It's a pretty unique premise, and the more I think about it, the more I really like how the story is set up through these characters. What elevates the characters and story even further is the superb writing and vocal performance found within the game. It teeters on the edge of being too self-indulgent in its delivery, but it never goes over that edge. Across the world, different races and nationalities have different accents and speaking patterns, further adding to the vibe and lived-in feeling of the world. No other title in the franchise executed like this, and it makes 12 stand out so much in comparison. As with Vagrant story and tactics, the story here focuses on empire and politics. Again, as a dumb kid, I hated both of those things and didn't understand what it was trying to say. Now, I found myself deeply engaged in the story it was telling. I don't think it does anything to completely redefine a political drama, but it does enough to nail the finer points and present a compelling character-driven narrative. At the very least, the world it creates left me wanting more in the best kind of way. The story does a really good job of combining the grounded, gritty politics of empires with the mysterious and fanciful fantasy of magic and gods. The biggest problem with the story is that it feels cut short. Undoubtedly a casualty of the development struggles, the pacing near the end of the game really ramps up, and our slow, measured progress from point to point turns to giant leaps and bounds. It's a little jarring, and because of the breakneck tempo, doesn't do the best job of setting up its delivery for the climax. It does, however, nail its post-climax and gives a pretty satisfying epilogue that wraps everything up in a neat package. Final Fantasy XII is a complicated game. It is by no means perfect, and the struggles of its development are easily seen when looking at it critically. But on the flip side of that same coin, what they were able to deliver and accomplish giving all of that strife and turmoil is simply outstanding. We'll never truly get to know what Final Fantasy XII could have been, and that is a shame. But the game we got, while flawed, is so immense and packed with so much to experience that it's hard to imagine more added on. From the moment the game starts, you can see the effort that went into creating the detailed world of Ivalice. I cannot overstate how amazingly crafted each and every environment in the game is. Every location tells a story in both its visual presentation and through its accompanying audio. I don't think any other game in the entire franchise nails its world vibe as well as 12 does. One question still remains. Would I recommend this as your entry point into the franchise? No, I don't think I would. Don't get me wrong, it's a phenomenal game and deserves to be played, but it doesn't do the franchise as a whole justice. If you were to take away all the Final Fantasy branding here, I think the game would have done just as well, if not better, since it would not have had the same expectations placed upon it. I'm so glad I went back and replayed this game, because it absolutely shattered the notions I held about it. The Zodiac Age remaster is easily one of my favorite installments in the entire series now, and before this I would have ranked it near the bottom. In the history of the series, 12 will be remembered as part of the fall from grace, and that is harsh. But conversely, it will also be remembered as a part of its return to form, as the Zodiac Age remaster was hugely popular and successful. And that's kind of beautifully poetic for this game. So much controversy, so much turmoil, and out of all of that pressure emerged a diamond. In the rough at first, but as time went on, beautifully polished into what we have today. Go play Final Fantasy XII. Go experience Ivalice. You won't regret it.